So first things first, starting with the title, 20 years of SRE, long time. Let's not fixate on the accuracy of that particular phrase. I think we should use it as an opportunity to reflect on the past. And in the spirit of this, and also in the spirit of the fact that SREcon Americas makes me miss my national holiday, St. Patrick's Day, March the 17th, every single year, here is Midjourney's rendering of 20 years of SRE in the style of an ancient Irish medieval illuminated manuscript, which I greatly prefer to the rendering of the first attempt, which I think nicely illustrates the importance of reliability in AI. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover, 20 years in 20 minutes plus questions. So by linear extrapolation, that's 1 year per minute. So I'll talk very quickly, obviously. Who am I and why should you care? I suppose I'm probably more responsible than most for popularizing SRE in terms of this book, which you can see in the picture on the left. I am very happy to find on the commercial shelves of a bookshop somewhere down in the valley, actually. So, seen a few things. There's a picture of me ripping it up, which is part of a previous SREcon opening plenary, if I recall correctly. Here's a picture of me writing another one. The other photo, on a personal note, is my stepmother, Helen Gray, who passed away last month, and to whom this talk is dedicated. And on that personal note, I want to emphasize that this is a personal view of a talk, right? So there's no giant multinational, there's no PR department. PR department is me. So in other words, if I'm missing your favorite thing, it's because of my limited view and limited perspective. So just want to make that clear. But with all of those preliminaries out of the way, anyone take a guess what this is?
Elephant in the server room.
It's the elephant in the server room.
An accident waiting to happen.
So popular English phrase meaning the obvious thing known as talking bet. And the elephant in the server room is, of course, Google. The image here is an internal meme that got leaked to BuzzFeed, if I recall correctly. So there's going to be a certain amount of Google in this presentation. You are unfortunately going to have to be okay with that. But I began my reflections on 20 years by thinking about the evolution of the role and the change in perceptions of this role. And I realized that I kind of have an internal story about what SRE is and how it's changed, which is different to many other people. And in fact, I think there's one key story which has grown up around Google and relationship with SRE that I think it's necessary to attack, actually. So I appreciate this may be shocking to you, but sometimes stories aren't true, or different sets of stories are available depending on the evidence you select from. So I'll take one story to start with, which is that Google is smooth and relentless and infallible and gigantic and so on and so forth. And SRE, as a result, inherits those properties. And so we think of SRE as kind of having a machine-like quality, right? So giant resources, giant machine, giant problems, so on. But other stories are available. To do so, I'll have to talk a little bit about startups. So startups, what are startups like? Startups are like eating glass, as Sean Parker and a number of other people said. Various other entrepreneurs have said. Startups have a lot of characteristics that make them kind of not really like ordinary life. So there isn't really a steady state. Things are changing all the time, and if they aren't, that's bad. Relentless pressure, and so on. The shocking news or the different story is that Google was a startup once as well. And so one thing that's kind of developed over time is that people seem to think that SRE is somehow in opposition to or incompatible with constant change, fast-moving startups in general, and so on. I think there's a bunch of reasons that people believe this, but I want to hone in on one for brevity's sake. Might not be your favorite reason, but it is this, that people seem to think that startup chaos, relentless pressure, not enough resources being incompatible is a function of, I suppose, clarity, or the pressure to produce means that you output bad solutions because you haven't got the time to do better solutions. And so not that I'm saying that finishing your slides 5 minutes before you get on stage produces your best work all of the time. Necessary short-term clarity around choices has produced some of my best work, although for the sake of engineering coherence, I feel I should tell you it has also produced some of my worst work. But there is this conflict, right? And I think it's curious to me to hear how the story of SRE has become, for want of a better term, a very big company. Because in my experience, one very real loop that drives work in startups is the following, which is putting the slightly less terrible thing in place before tomorrow's terrible thing happens. And so the way you get from one of these things to another is by engineering. And in my opinion, in my story, SRE grows from this, not as a brake on progress, not as a necessary component of a planet-spanning multinational, not as an infinitely large, smoothly working machine. But you're doing things while they're useful. Then when they're not, you stop doing them. You start doing different things instead. The story is really driven by engineering. And so let me tell you a story about the early days, which I was not present for all of, to be clear. So I am relying on research and stories. But there was a file at one stage called cluster.py. Google Production starts off very, very simply. There's essentially a list of machines, and specific software runs on specific machines. So there's arrays defined in some Python somewhere, and it's like, okay, the indexing is on machine 1, comma, machine 3, comma, whatever. Okay, fine. So it turns out machines go down, change roles, so on and so forth. And how do people handle this? Well, they fork the file and add their own stuff until eventually there's one fork for every FTE. Or, well, not quite that bad, but, close to that. So eventually something better is needed. And can't buy anything to do this, right? It's all internal stuff. So there's a system built called, I think, Babysitter that has been talked about publicly. And it's really based around the astonishing realization that if you can provide some mechanism to change the arrays at runtime, you don't actually need to fork the script. Anyway, very successful. So this is the key point. Babysitter is terrible, but it's incrementally less terrible than the thing that was before it. And so in due course, it buys us time to put in other things. Work queue and Borg and a bunch of other kind of systems come along and solve various components of the cluster scheduling workload. And so I would say that SRE as an organization would be centrally involved in this, but actually this is too early. Like SRE doesn't even exist at this point, but SRE thinking does. There's a set of people who care about production, no matter what they're called, and their inclination is to engineer their way out of problems. Often engineering directly into more problems, but definitely engineering their way out of problems. Okay. So I've been talking a lot about stories, playing a role in how you understand yourself. Obviously, every good superhero needs an origin story. Alas, so do the evil ones. So one is the, for want of a better term, official story. So Ben Traynor-Sloss does a great job of organizational alignment and storytelling and so on. Following on from the work I discovered in my research of Mika Bloomfield, who's manager of the very earliest production teams in Google. Wanted to mention her name publicly. But other stories are available. Other selections from the evidence are available. Item 2 is another story. It's not as well sourced, right? So it basically says that from very early on, there is a sense that Google doesn't want to hire folks who are just going to follow playbooks for the act of system management, want people who could actually write software, automate the playbooks, et cetera, et cetera. I can't verify this, I have been told it. I think it does play into the situational awareness for toil that Google SRE in particular has, and that maybe not a lot of other places have, actually. But 3 is kind of what I've been talking about, what I want to surface, which is, I think beyond any confusion around naming or title or role, or any of that stuff is the core facts that A, when you get people who care about production, and B, when they're allowed to, when they can engineer stuff in production, you get magic happening. And so when I reflect back on the gigantic progress of SRE over these 20 years, which is actually, like, it is really something. This thing we do from before the earliest days that it had this name to this gigantic thing it's become, and how utterly bizarre that seems in retrospect. I try to hang on to those two facts, A and B, to keep me grounded. Okay, proselytizing over. Let's move on from history somewhat, and earliest days to themes and ideas, highlights and lowlights we can pick out of the course of history. So let's start out with the obvious one. SRE teams are everywhere. This set of logos that I stuck up there is absolutely not a definitive list. It is the list of places that had jobs open when on Saturday I opened the tab and did the search. But it gives you a flavor of the places that SRE's made its way into. And so from a sectoral point of view, it's like entertainment, food delivery, education, retail, government, trading, driverless cars, yada, yada, yada. I also have reason to believe that, according to conference data at least, SRE is not the sole province of planet-spanning multinationals, but has made its way into SMEs, mid-range companies, and so on. The middle range having thickened out significantly over time, which I think is a good sign for the profession. So SRE material continues to sell well. I'm not looking happy because of this. I make no money from this book. Why is SRE material continuing to sell well? Actually, the model is new. And I know you are sitting in your chair going, well, actually, it's 20 years old. You just told us. Of course, the industry is large, and it takes a lot of time for ideas to propagate, and models in particular, even if it's only the top tier you care about. But I would say that if your world is just DevOps or ITIL or Platform Eng or whatever, there is a genuine gap into which SRE can fit. There is a legitimate, oh, excellent. Will this collapse underneath me? No, it won't. I'll move over here. That'll make it better. So if your world is DevOps, ITIL, Platform Eng, et cetera, the SRE model does have something to say to you about how systems should be managed, how organizations should be run or structured, so on. I think net, the market continues to grow, and people want to continue to learn about it. I mean, that's why you're here. That's why there's a huge proportion of new folks, which I was very interested to see. But also, and this is a bit weird, but it is true, the content of these books is available for free, and yet I know they still get bought, they still get read online in various ways that actually cost money as opposed to not costing money. So that suggests to me that there's still significant demand for what's regarded as high quality information. So this book's title, for those who can't read it, is Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea, which is the implicit title of a number of engineering conversations I have been in. The general point I am trying to make is that there's a ton of ideas about how to understand the problem of software and systems management, creation, design, and so on, outlined in our body of knowledge. And it would be one set of consequences for the universe if that knowledge was kind of scoped to us and jealously guarded and so on and so forth. But actually, I don't think it's that way. I think it has escaped. And it's obviously hard to come up with objective measures for this in some sense. But hey, I've got 20 minutes, so we're on to anecdotes. The frequency I have noticed of explaining certain SRE ideas to kind of, shall we say, generic software engineers or product engineers has dropped. So I find that I don't have to define, for example, SLOs as often as I did several years ago, et cetera. The knowledge is permeating out there. Another thing I see is that cross-referencing to SRE ideas, whether in the form of the book or papers or talks or whatever, is also increasing over time. I do think there's room for science in looking at this, but certainly my experience is that these two effects are definitely ongoing. But as well as SRE ideas permeating general engineering, I think also some of them have made their way into general business consciousness, which is also pretty weird. So Gartner and Forrester, for those who don't know, are kind of very large and important IT organizations, IT strategy organizations, kind of. Might have heard of the Gartner Magic Quadrant and a bunch of other things. Anyway, they tell other organizations what to think about IT. And one of the consequences of the massive popularity of the thing that we're doing is that the machinery of business sat up and took notice. And I won't use the phrase churns out, but writes a lot of stuff about SRE. And hence you see articles like this from Forrester and claims like this from Gartner. As I say, both well-known and extremely salient organizations. I think, in particular, I suppose you could query the numbers in the Gartner statement that by 2027, 75% of enterprises will use SRE practices, up from 10% in 22. But I think whatever about the state of those numbers, SRE has created that conversation, has revolutionized that conversation. Like, we're not having that sentence isn't written in a world where SRE doesn't happen. And I think it's also interesting to note that this Forrester article from 2018 doesn't conclude 46% of them of Google's SRE principles apply directly to your enterprise. What about the rest? No, they're terrible, don't use them. It concludes that a bunch of the rest are also applicable under different kind of circumstances. So in some sense, the IT industry has looked at this and has picked the things that apply and has found that it actually works for them. Yeah, I think another point I would say, just hammering on the engineering piece again, is SRE teams over the past 20 years have got a lot of engineering done. Again, this is my personal experience, this is my very limited view, my myopia. But as an example, here are two papers describing Google systems that I had sight of what the SRE contribution was, and it was vital to both of them. And both of those systems were very successful internally. I think I'm pretty sure the one on the right is still working, and if the one on the left isn't working, bad things are happening right now. Externally, like, these papers have gone on to be cited hundreds of times. Like, there's huge impact from these things. I highlight the SRE contributor names as I remember them, but of course I might forget them, et cetera, et cetera. So again, from my personal point of view, it's also been great to see so many SREs doing work that benefits others, aware of a wider kind of social context, or again, for want of a better term, ethical. I'm actually fascinated by this, and I've thought about it a lot over the years. Like, why is this? Is it because that SRE as a profession kind of thinks about the user or is geared around the positive experience of somebody else on a day-to-day basis? Or is it because of this strong sense of above and beyond or mission orientation that Google SRE certainly had early on? Or maybe the historical accident of a bunch of people who joined early on. Either way, it is notable, to me at least, that for such a young profession, we've already had 2 Time magazine covers with SRE people on them. On the left, the US healthcare system, such as it was, rescued by SREs. I think Mikey Dickerson, who you may hear from later on, goes on to lead a substantial government department to try and do more of the same. And on the right, it's Susan Fowler, SRE at Uber, whose memo helps to kick off the Me Too movement. And I think, again, for people who feel SRE has nothing to do with this, that actually fixing broken systems and fixing broken organizational systems and organizational postmortems are very definitely part of what SRE does. I surfaced these two examples because they're convenient graphically. I could mention others, Liz Fong-Jones and Kiwi Farms and a bunch of other stuff prominently, again, from my limited perspective. I would also note that when generic software engineers have made it to the cover of Time, it's not necessarily because of the benefit to other people. So continuing on that topic, I just want to explore a little bit more in the context of this quote of a review of the SRE book that Chris Jones pointed me at recently, which is the SRE book has granted me the cursed knowledge, to see that the misery of toil and burnout, is entirely preventable. And I think SRE at its best has a long history of doing things differently because it is the right thing to do, not because we did it that way previously or we're always going to do it this way or whatever. But here, if the only thing we did as a profession, if literally the only thing we accomplished was to help the industry understand that actually it might be cursed knowledge, but actually burnout and toil and so on are preventable, it would be worth it on its own. Now, okay, lowlights. So in true centrist dad fashion, time for the lowlights. First thing I will start with is the career pipeline. The career pipeline, I think, is particularly problematic in SRE for junior level folks. In fact, I'm aware of one org where it was suggested SRE should only be defined for senior level and up. And I have said elsewhere that one close analog for SRE is staff engineer, like those kind of cross-cutting concerns that you often see staff engineers blessed with can resonate in the SRE world as well. But if we can't ingest folks at the bottom of the profession and get them to the top, and if we can't take all of the folks who want to do that, then we have some trouble. And SRE is intimidating from the outside. I mean, despite the wealth of educational material available, we should do more about that. This was a ATM in New Orleans where I refrained from pushing either of those buttons, though I was tempted. Device initialize in particular. It is useful, it's useful balance, I think, to say that as well as the success in adoption that we've outlined earlier, we have also seen plenty of failures in SRE program adoption and in companies that would normally be considered kind of fertile ground for this kind of thing. So large, well-resourced, technically capable, a lot at stake, and so on. My personal regret from these is not that the adoption failed, but that it's not in the nature of the industry to write organizational postmortems, and I would love to see those for the adoption failures. It is also kind of unpopular puffin opinion of me, but as well as the genuine problems that are caused by the mishandling of the term SRE, dilution of what it means, problems with the implementation, and so on. We worry about that a lot, in my opinion, possibly worry about identity too much. Maybe we should do less of that. In particular, I've spoken about this in detail in other kind of talks, including other SRE keynotes, so I won't labor this point. But I will say that I don't feel we're really generating enough models about what it is that we are doing or trying to do. I specifically highlight mathematical there because I do think we have a lot of qualitative models. We could always use more, and that's totally fine. But I think we need some more quantitative models about what it is we're doing. And in particular, quantitative models about being able to put generic numeric frameworks on the value of what it is we do, on how much our work matters. And I think my personal intuition is there's a lot of runway for this, and we just aren't really getting started. It's our most urgent problem, in my opinion. You will be familiar with the fact that zero interest rates have gone away. My mortgage certainly is very familiar with that fact. Thank you. It has changed a bunch of behaviors in companies, aligning with layoffs, attitudes to expenditure for operations, keeping things going, and so on. Again, I've spoken about this before, won't embellish it, but I will say that attacking the ideas that reliability no longer matters because growth is unavailable, which is an argument I've heard, and because we can't put a good number on the worth of the user experience, we won't invest in it. Those are kind of key ideas to attack. And for what it's worth, I say abstract economic bases there because I'm pretty sure the customers still want their stuff to work, whatever the abstract economic rationale is. And I think also there's several patterns which are pretty prevalent in human behavior, and one of those is the tendency to confuse doctrine with identity. And so it's particularly natural if your world has been significantly disrupted. You may end up clinging to doctrine in some sense if you don't have an easy replacement to hand. But my final low light, and I do think it's an important one, is underpinning some of the earlier lowlights, at least at decision maker level, is the persistent idea that operations is low status. So of course, worth is socially constructed to a large extent. And it's also true that we have a societal bias against keeping things going or kind of paying for keeping things going. A bias, a kind of intellectual bias in some sense against good pattern execution rather than creation of new patterns and so on. And I can stand here and say that I think we need to fix this, which is true. But in a talk which is mostly about reflection, I'm thinking about the relationship with SRE and the past 20 years. And all of that does put me in mind of one potential summary of the past 20 years, which is, to wit, the radical idea that it is legitimate to apply software techniques and systems thinking to the operations domain. And in 2024, I stand here, and I look at the past 20 years, and I look at the state of the industry and the state of the world, and I say that that idea is still radical. Thanks for your time. Come and see it at the booth. Thank you very much.